What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So this might be the most important video you watch, learning how to use SketchUp free. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about some concepts that are going to be really important. So please don't skip this video because these things are going to save you a ton of time when you're working inside of SketchUp free. Okay, and so up till now, we've learned the basics of drawing in SketchUp and we've modeled a house. But I want to get into something that's really important, which is the concept of grouping geometry. So let's say right now that we create a simple box inside of SketchUp free, and then we're going to create another box right here. You might have run into this up to this point where if you take these two objects, so if I select this object, tap the M key, and then single click on the corner and move this over here, what happens is the geometry merges together. Like notice how now if I try to move this box away from the original box, the faces merge together and this just merges into a complete shape like this. And I'm going to undo that right here. And so sometimes that behavior is desirable, right? So say that you had like a cabinet box or something like this. This is just the outside of the cabinet. But if I was to select this geometry, I could use the move tool in order to move it around. Well, notice how if I move it on the red axis right here, that I'm actually deforming the object using that sticky geometry or the geometry that's stuck together. So it can be desirable, but most of the time you don't want this because what happens is you get all this geometry that's kind of like merged together. And then if you try to make changes, you've got this just like sticky mess inside of your model that you don't necessarily want. And so one thing that we can do in order to avoid this is we can use what's known as grouping objects. So say that I was to select this box right here. Well, you can right click on an object and you can click on the option for group or make group. Well, now notice how instead of on this object where I click on each one of these faces and the faces select individually, well, if I click anywhere on this object, it's just going to show up with a bounding box. The reason why it's showing up as a bounding box is this is visually indicating to me that this geometry is in a group. Well, what that means is now if I take this object and I move it over here, and then I move it away, notice how that geometry doesn't merge. The reason why that geometry doesn't merge is because as soon as you put geometry inside of a group right here, it's not going to merge the geometry with anything outside of the group. And to edit inside of the group, what you can do is you can just double click on an object. Notice how when you double click on an object, you get this bounding box right here. And then you're able to come in here and you're able to like push pull like faces and other things like that. Just like this. And so I could take both of these objects and I could put them in groups. So I'm going to select this, put it in a group. Now both of these objects are grouped, and so neither one of these will merge with other geometry inside of your model. So like same thing over here, like this. Now, one thing to note about this, so editing, you double click in order to get in here. If you ever want to ungroup an object, you can select it. You can right click on it and click on the option to explode. Notice how when I explode that, what happens is this goes back to just being like edges and faces inside of the three-dimensional space. So that's definitely something you can do. Now, one thing to note about this is you can nest groups. So what that means is that if I do a shift click right here and I select both of these, I can right click and I can do a make group right here. So notice how now I've got the bounding box around both of these objects. And so if I ever wanted to edit them or adjust them, what I would do is I would double click in here. And then say I wanted to adjust them outside of the individual groups, I can just move this around. Notice how that bounding box kind of moves in when I move this right here. But I could also double click again to go inside of this group right here. And now I can edit that. And then when I'm done, I can just click out of the group just like this. So you can put multiple objects in groups. And then if you ever wanted to ungroup these, you could right click and explode that. And notice how it just goes back to whatever level is right below your overall level in the grouping hierarchy. Okay, and so now we've talked about grouped, and groups are basically just walling off geometry, right? Like taking objects and just walling them off as you draw them. I usually recommend as soon as you draw something, you drop it in a group, because the biggest issue that I see a lot of people struggle with inside of SketchUp is they have this like big spaghetti mess of geometry because they haven't grouped anything. So say that you're drawing like walls or something like that. I usually recommend before you even extrude to 3D, you take the wall and you put it in a group. then you can double click in it and extrude it to 3D. But what that means is that your wall isn't merging with your floor. So group as you model, I guess is what I'm saying. But now I want to introduce you to another concept, which is the concept of a component. And so what a component is it's basically a smart group. And so what that means is when you select this object, right click on it and go to make component instead of make group, you're going to get this little pop-up window right here that allows you to name this. And so in this case, I'm just going to call this box and click on create. And notice if you click on the drop down, there's other things that you can edit or adjust about this. We're not going to talk too much about this in this video. We're just going to click on the option for create. But usually, so I don't want always face camera turned on, and I don't want cut opening or shadows face sun to be turned on. So I'm just going to click on create right here. Well, what we've done is we've created what's known as a component. And if you go into your entity info, notice how this tells you that this is a solid component, and it tells you the component definition. So that's basically the name of the definition of the component. Now, why this is important, we'll come back to that in just a second, is say that I was to make a copy here. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to make copies in just a second. So make sure you stick around for that, because that is a huge time saver. But notice how with these boxes right here, if I double click in here and I edit one of them, the others are going to adjust at the same time. The reason why is because when we created an instance of a component called box, SketchUp learned, okay, a box is this thing. And no matter how many copies of this thing we create, I want all of the copies of that component to adjust at the same time. So that does not happen. Say that we were to create a cylinder, but in this case, we were to take the cylinder and put it in a group and then make copies. Well, notice how if we make multiple copies of that and I adjust one of these, they're not linked together because that's just a copy of a group rather than a copy of a component. So if we wanted these to stay the same, what we would do, and you can do this with geometry that's been grouped, you can just right click on it and click on make component. And I'm just going to call this cylinder right here. We're going to click on create. Well, now I've made that into an instance. And since it's an instance, now these other things are going to adjust at the same time, like this. So now let's say that we wanted some of these instances to be different than others. Well, there's an option inside of SketchUp for components where you can select components, but if you right click on them, you can click on the option for make unique. So when I do that, what SketchUp is going to do is it's going to create a new component definition over here for the unique ones. So now notice how these have the definition of cylinder, these have the definition of cylinder 1. And we might change this to cylinder number 2 so that it makes a little bit more sense. But notice how when I change the definition name right here, the definition name has changed across all instances of this object. So now, if I was to make an adjustment right here, notice how those first 3 objects that I didn't make unique are adjusting, but then these other 2 have a different definition, so those are going to adjust separately, like this. So this is massively helpful for if you create like light fixtures or something like that across your model. And anything that you're going to have more than one of in SketchUp, you should create as a component, because that way you can go back and you can change them all at the same time just by changing them once instead of remodeling over and over. And so just as kind of a review, components are for objects there's more than one of in your model. Groups are for things in your model that there's only going to be one of. So if you create a floor plan or something like that, you would take the walls and you would just group them. You wouldn't create a component with those because it wouldn't make any sense, right? Like you're not going to have like multiple copies of your walls in a model. So there's really no reason to create that as a component. Now, if you're doing something with like options or something like that, you might create this as a component, but generally grouping is for taking geometry and keeping it from merging together. Components are for repeating objects inside of your models. Okay, so next up is something you're going to use a lot, and this is going to save you a massive amount of time when it comes to creating copies of objects inside of SketchUp. So I think most users kind of intuitively understand the concept of selecting an object, doing a Control-C, and doing a Control-V. That allows you to paste an object. And that's kind of a valid way of creating copies of things, but notice how it's very imprecise, right? Like it's very difficult for me once I do a Control-C and a Control-V to create a copy to like pick the right point that I want to use inside of SketchUp. And so what I recommend instead of using a copy paste, what I recommend instead is I recommend using one of the lesser known functions of the move tool, at least for beginners, which is copy mode. And so we've talked a little bit about the move tool. Remember, you tap the M key, you set a base point, and then you set the point at which you want the object to be placed in order to move the object, right? However, there's also an option when you have that move tool active. So tap M with the object selected, click on the corner and move your mouse in the direction that you want. Well, if you tap the control key, what that's going to do is that's going to put you in copy mode right here. And so what that's done is that's basically allowed me to create a copy of this object. And if you wanted to, you could type in a value here. So I would move my mouse along the green axis and type in a value of maybe 3 feet right here in order to create this copy of this object. But you can use this in order to create copies. And the cool thing about the move tool is, remember that you don't need to have your base point on the object itself when you activate the tool. So what that means is if I select this cylinder, tap the M key, and then mouse over a point, I can actually set a base point on another object over here. Well, what that means is that I could tap the control key and I could create a copy of this object that's also got the same spacing that this one over here had. So this is massively helpful for creating copies of objects because it allows you to be very precise in where you place the copies. Now, not only does the move tool have copy mode, which a lot of people know about, but it also has an array function. So what the array function means is it means that you can take an object, you can tap the M key, single click in the corner, and tap the control key. And the sequence here is really important, by the way. So you can click in order to set your object without clicking on anything else, right? So the move tool is still active. You can see how the move tool's options are still down here. All I've done is clicked in order to place this object. Well, if I type in star in a number of copies, so like 5, and hit the enter key, that's going to create 5 equally spaced copies of this object. Now, the cool thing about this, and this is another reason why we don't like to click and drag, we just like to single click in order to place an object, but notice how this is still active. So if I don't like that, I can type in star 4 and hit the enter key, star 8 and hit the enter key, star 2 and hit the enter key. I can basically use this in order to create as many copies as I would like. So in this situation, let's say we want to do this again. The full sequence would be select the object, tap the M key, single click to set your base point, tap Control in order to activate copy mode, click to set your first copy, and then type in star, number of copies, enter, right here. And so you can also do this by typing in distances. So if I do M, Control, click, and I type in 5 feet, and hit enter, and then type in star 3, and hit enter again, it's going to create 3 copies like this, or star 5, or whatever. Now, let's say that we wanted to, and by the way, you can use this in order to create copies of multiple different things in here. So I could select all of these and use the move tool in copy mode in the same way right here. So notice how I'm able to really quickly create as many copies as I want of objects just by pre-selecting them before I activate that move tool right here, like this. Now, another cool function of this tool that a lot of people don't know about is it also has the ability to create equally spaced copies between points using the /. So if I do the same thing, so single click, tap Control, and move my mouse out here, and I figure out the other side of this, and then I type in a / and a number of copies, this will create copies equally spaced between the 2 points that I set as well. So you can use this both to multiply to create equally spaced copies, or divide to create equally spaced copies between 2 points. And so practically, where something like this might be really valuable is, let's say we wanted to create a fence. So what I've got, right, is I've got a fence right here, and I'm going to have a fence support. So what I would do is I would just tap the Control key, single click, and move my mouse up like this. And then for the posts themselves, I would use the move tool in copy mode, and I would set this point as my base point because I want to line it with the end. But then I could just create my copy right here, type in / and 2 in order and hit the enter key in order to place a middle point right here. But then we could do the same thing where we're going to take this, we're going to move it over, and notice how what I'm doing to align this is I'm just moving this along the red axis and then the green axis. But for these, what we might do is use the move tool in copy mode here to create a copy on this point, and then we can just type in / times 5 or times 10, or sorry, the / it would be divided by 5 or divided by 15 or divided by 20 right here. So notice how I can set the number of copies that I can create in here. Now, one other thing to think about when you're doing things like this, say you wanted this fence to continue and I wanted to create multiple copies of this fence. Well, what I would do is I would select the whole thing and then use the move tool in copy mode. But notice how that's going to give me a duplicate fence post right here. So the right way to do this would be you would want to select only these right here and not this last one. Or actually, you're going to want the end one and not the first one. And if I do a move tool in copy mode now, notice how I'm not going to have that duplicate like this, right? And you want to make sure that you keep it aligned, meaning you need to make sure that you set a good base point right here. So now we're in good shape like this. Now, the other thing I might do in this situation is I would probably re-add the pickets in here after I've created all of the supports. That way I can ensure that everything is going to be copied properly from here to the end. So we're just going to do this right here and type in /, and in this case it's probably like 40 fences or fence pickets right here. You can see how adding that fence was really easy. And so there's one other thing I want to talk about, and that's the way that curves work in SketchUp. So for most of your curves, what you're going to use is you're going to use the 2-point arc tool right here. There's also an option in here for a 3-point arc, but I rarely use it because it's difficult to be precise. So usually I use this 2-point arc. And so if I tap the A key, that's going to activate the arc tool. So what I can do with the arc tool is I can single click again in order to set 2 points, and then you can set a bulge right here in order to create a curve. And so curves in SketchUp are something that you kind of need to understand just because they're a little bit weird in the sense that if I look at this, right, this curve doesn't look super smooth. Well, the reason this curve doesn't look super smooth is because it's actually made up of a whole bunch of different segments in here. I can actually like inference to the segment points on this arc. And you can adjust the number of segments by going into your entity info and adding segments. So I can type in something like 24 or 36 or something like that. The more segments, the smoother your curve is going to look. But let's say we set this to 12 segments right here. And we're just going to draw a line across this face or across to the other point right here in order to give us a face. Well, when I pull that up, what that's doing is that's taking this curve and it's extruding it up into 3D. Like this. And that's actually very interesting because the way that SketchUp creates curved faces is by basically making a whole bunch of flat faces that approximate curved faces. And so what I mean by that is if you've ever tried to push-pull a curved face, you've probably gotten this message. The reason why is because this is actually made up of a whole bunch of individual faces. And you can actually see that by going into the display option and checking the box for hidden geometry. So when you do that, notice that you can see, okay, this is made up of a whole bunch of individual faces like this. So that hidden geometry is basically geometry that sits in your model, but then when you tell SketchUp to hide it, it kind of merges the faces together like this. And so the reason that's important is because you can actually use that to your advantage. So first off, say that you did want an arc with a very smooth face. Well, when you first activate the arc tool, you can actually set the number of sides. So I could type in like 64 or something like that and draw an arc like this. And then if I draw a line across this right here and extrude it up, this face is actually a lot smoother than the other one over here. Though you can't really tell with the hidden geometry turned off. But notice if I toggle this on, the individual faces that are created, there's going to be 64 of them rather than the 12 that are going to be over here. That's driven by the number of edges in the segment that you create. And so let's say that we were to draw an arc, and let's say it only had 4 sides right here. So one of the things you might have run into, and I'm going to do something real quick where I come in here, right click and explode the curve. Something that you might have run into in the past is you might have run into this issue where when you extrude an object, these edges are actually solid rather than hidden, and it means that it actually extrudes this up as individual faces. And I'm going to make a copy of this really quick so we can take a look at that in a second. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can fix this. So the first way is you can actually either individually select edges and go to the entity info, or you can use the eraser tool. But if I come in here and click on the option for soften edges right here, notice what that's going to do if I toggle my hidden geometry off, is that's actually going to soften this so that you can't select those edges in here, and it treats this face as an individual face. So you can also soften edges. So I'm going to do a Control Z. For those, you can also soften edges by activating the eraser tool and holding the Control key or tapping the Control key. Now, if I click across this like this, notice how it comes in here and it softens those edges like this. Now, if you ever do have a face that comes up with the edges right here, if you just select these edges before you extrude it, so I'm just going to select these right here, right click, and I'm going to do a weld edges. Well, when you weld the edges, notice how this now shows up as a full curve. Well, now if I extrude this up, it's going to give me that softened face like this. And so one other thing that you should understand is, in addition to having an arc tool, the circle tool works in the same way. So notice how if I tap the C key right here, it gives me a number of sides. And when I create this circle, it's going to have the number of edges in the outside, the number of segments right here that we had set when we drew the circle. So notice how I could adjust this. So I could bring this down or up in order to get smoother or less smooth results like this. So let's say, for example, that I had, we're going to pick that face up to 3 circles. Well, if I take this first one and I tell it it has 3 segments in it, notice how you actually get a triangle. And in principle, a 3-sided circle is a triangle, right? Same thing over here. If I adjust this to maybe like 6 segments, I get a hexagon, or 8, I get an octagon. So you can use this in order to create geometric shapes as well, just by adjusting the number of edges in the circle. And then when you extrude these up, notice how the shape that's created is obviously going to be a little bit different for each one of these, right? And so one other thing to note about this is notice how these faces look a little bit weird. So the reason they look a little bit weird is because when you select the hidden geometry in your object, so I'm going to go back into my display, click on hidden geometry. So these edges, notice how these are set not only to soften edges, but also to smooth edges. And so what soften and smooth edges does is it tries to take the faces right here and make them look smoother, right? So over here, these faces have kind of like this gradient effect in here, and it's trying to make this look as smooth as possible. That's because that edge that's on the corner is set to smooth edges. Notice how if I toggle that off, these just look like individual faces. So if you ever have faces like this and you want to try to make them look a little bit more uniform, you can check the box or click the little slider for smooth edges in order to try to do that. And then when you toggle your hidden geometry off like this, then they're going to look a lot smoother. And typically when you create an object or extrude an object to 3D like this, those are going to be naturally, or those are going to be set to soften and smooth edges by default when you extrude the object to a 3D shape. Okay, and so practically this matters because let's say that we wanted to apply a material in here, which I know we haven't really talked about materials all of that much, but we're going to add just a blue material right here. Well, right now, if I apply a blue material to this object, it's going to apply it across the entire face because this is acting as a giant softened and smooth face. However, if you wanted to apply a material to the individual parts and pieces, you could actually turn the hidden geometry on and then apply the material, right? And so by doing that, what that does is that allows you to apply materials to each one of the individual faces in here like this. So practically you can use that hidden geometry, and then notice how if I click on this now, it's going to show like this entire face just as one smoothed face. But practically, if you ever need to apply different materials to different parts of faces or something like that, you might consider coming in here and messing around with the hidden geometry in order to allow you to do that. All right, so you will use the grouping, the components, and the move tool in copy mode a lot. So make sure you practice with those and you're comfortable with them because they're going to save you so much time overall. I will link to the entire playlist for getting started with SketchUp free on this page. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.